The story I'm going to talk about is an amazing story, and I can tell you that I don't want to take a lot of credit because I'm telling you a story that's been told and the information has been dug up by some very heroic people. Parents, physicians, legislators, so I'm here to tell you in a way a lot of other people's stories, and I've just put it together, but I'm humbled to have the opportunity to tell you an amazing story. This is a CD-ROM, and it's not audio, it's a computer disc, and they're available. Barbara has it at the desk. And it's got, I don't know how many hundreds of hours of research on it. My talks for this talk are on there in the full form. I've got about 800 slides for the talk. I have about 10 hours of lecture, and I'm not going to give it to you right now. But it's there for you, so I would advise don't take notes because my presentations are more like a movie than they are a talk. I use, as a radiologist, I'm very visual, so I'm using graphics to tell the story, and so I'd advise you just to sit back and take it in, and you will have everything that I'm showing on the CD-ROM. I just wanted to tell you the organization of this CD. Can you all see that from where you're at? There's 4 folders in this CD-ROM, and the first folder is called Autism Resources, and that's a very organized file that was part of a kind of a commercial project I did a year ago that's largely on the science and politics of mercury-induced autism. The third folder here, Radio Liberty, has 2 PDF files, Adobe Acrobat files, and those will have everything in this talk. The fourth file there, called World Politics, has got all the documentation, about 95% of the documentation I'm using today, so I try to document everything I say. Well, the story begins really with thimerosal, or mercury, in vaccines. It's been put in vaccines for decades. I want to introduce you to the villain in this story. This is thimerosal, which is ethyl mercury. It's an organic mercury. It's used as a preservative in vaccines. It's an Eli Lilly trademark. They're still making money on this till 2010. They no longer manufacture it, but they don't have a license agreement on this. What was in solution in the vaccines looked like a very small amount, 0.01%, and that really put a lot of regulators to sleep. They thought, well, it's just a small amount. It's been implicated in some just horrible diseases that we're seeing in our children. Autism, which is a developmental disorder, characterized by social or communication skills, usually lack of communication, social withdrawal, language disorders, including, most typically delayed in onset of language, behavioral disorders such as repetitive disorders, and you probably know quite a bit of that. But it's also probably implicated in the whole spectrum of neurodevelopmental problems, including ADD, ADHD, and some lesser forms. It is not a psychiatric disorder. 100% of these kids have multiple organ system abnormalities. And if the physicians and the mainstream physicians don't know it because they don't test for it, they don't look for it. And some of the signs, for example, GI disease could be manifested by a child screaming and screaming, or jumping on a couch, jabbing a pillow into his stomach because he has so much pain, but they just can't speak. So those are just described by most mainstream physicians as, well, that's just the behavioral disorder, when in fact it's severe gastroenteritis, and they don't look. So a number of abnormalities, primarily the GI tract and the immune system. The epidemic is just unquestionable. On average, since 1990, we've seen over 1,000%, 1,500% increases in state by state. So there's just no question that we're faced with an impressive epidemic. These are stats from Illinois, just to get you an idea. Now, I made a list of Illinois statistics because they keep track of other disorders that really dwarf the autism numbers. And these are disorders which could be due to mercury. At least it is biologically plausible. And look at some of these: speech and learning problems, non-specific developmental delays, emotional disturbances, even mental retardation. So if you look at the numbers in Illinois, we're close to 300,000 cases in 2003. And this is an underestimation by as much as 2/3. So we're looking at Illinois, perhaps 750,000 injured children. Just how much mercury? It's hard to make the argument if they really aren't talking about huge amounts. As I said, it's a 0.01% solution. It looks tiny, right? It contains 25 micrograms of mercury. It still sounds like a pretty small number. Let me give you a perspective. Water contamination with mercury is defined in parts per billion. 2 parts per billion means that the water is not usable. Toxic waste, if it has 200 parts per billion, it's defined as toxic waste. Fish, about 1,000 parts per billion the EPA will allow. Over that, it's unedible. Vaccines have 50,000 parts per billion. If a doctor dropped the vial on the floor, it would be toxic waste. But yet, they're comfortable injecting this into infants. The numbers we're talking about are circled here in the far column. The overdose, just with one flu shot. Now, they've taken out most of the shots except for influenza, 25 mics in a flu shot. A 6-month-old will get one shot. He will exceed EPA's limits by 16-fold. At the bottom of this column, you see a fetus, second trimester fetus. Mother gets a flu shot. It's over 250 times EPA's limit. If you got a shot today, average weight adult, 3.5 times EPA's limit. So even though they've taken 80% out of it out, what's in it is still enormously overdosed. Here's how bad it was. Starting about the late 80s, on the routine vaccine schedule, kids, look at this, at 2 months was getting 129 times, average weight, 129 times the EPA limit. So these numbers are absolutely mind-boggling. How did the FDA respond to this? And I know this probably is too small to see this, but what they did is they published a paper. It was just a position paper, and they said, you know what? The EPA is right, but you have to interpret it a certain way. What they did is they averaged how much mercury a kid got out over the first 6 months of life and divided it by 180 days. So they averaged it, and they go, well, it's just barely over. And that's like me taking, you're taking a cardiac drug. Take your 6 months supply of the drug today. As long as you average 1 pill a day, you're going to be fine. And that's just preposterous. Yet, the American Academy of Pediatrics advocates this. They support this interpretation. The controversy really starts, well, it starts decades ago, honestly, but what we see mostly is what the Institute of Medicine did. The Institute of Medicine was asked to take a look at this, and they did this in 2 different sessions. In July '01, they studied this and released their report. And they looked at, really the science wasn't that strong then, but they said, you know what, it's biologically possible that mercury in vaccines cause autism. Let's do the right thing, let's take it out, and even consider pulling it out of shelves. That's a pretty decent recommendation. But in 2004, they came back with even more profound science that was available, and they reversed their decision. They said, you know what, there's no biological plausibility. In fact, you shouldn't even spend any more research dollars on looking at it. It's not worth it. What happened? Well, these are the studies that they have accepted. They accepted during the 2 years between their first and their second meeting, 5 studies were published. And this is very important. I know it's after lunch and I'm going to talk science a little bit, but the level of deception you have to understand. Most physicians just don't understand this. Here's the level of deception. They accepted 5 epidemiology studies from mostly foreign countries and 1 toxicological study. Here it illustrates how flawed these papers are. In Denmark, 3 of the 5 studies were based on a psychiatric database in Denmark. In Denmark, children were getting about half of the mercury that we got here. Autism rates were 1/5. So what's apples and oranges? The papers that were published, the authors of the papers were tied to this company, Serum Stratton Institute, which is a for-profit vaccine maker. And 80% of their money comes from selling vaccine-containing mercuries to the United States. Why do they export them? Because it's illegal to use them in Denmark. Mercury was outlawed in Denmark. The fatal flaw in this study came in their study design. They compared a block of years from 70 to 90 when they had mercury in vaccines, and they compared the autism rates to the following years. And they saw that the rates went up after they took mercury out. So they concluded, hey, it can't be mercury because rates still went up. What they did is they increased the pool of kids they were counting by 13 times. They threw in outpatients. The first part of the study was only inpatients, which counts a very small amount of autistic diagnostic kids. So it's like me comparing cancer in Springfield, Illinois to cancer in Los Angeles and just counting cases and saying, wow, there's a lot more cancer in Los Angeles. You have to do a percentage, right? They didn't. Essentially, they didn't. They just, kicked up how many kids they were looking for. That's a fatal flaw. A fatal flaw. Here's what the data really showed. When it's corrected for the oversampling, autism in Denmark dropped by 2/3 when they took mercury out of vaccines. American Academy of Family Practice adopted this as a great study, and this was accepted by the AMA and the AAP. Fabulous study. An American study, a database done, sponsored by the CDC, and I think it was an HMO in Northern California, an HMO database, and it was a huge population of kids, vaccine safety data link. Here's the published data is in the far right. They found there was no relative risk. They looked at autism cases and how much mercury kids got, and they decided that there was no association. There are 5 generations of that data. It went through 5 revisions, not seen by public eyes, obtained through Freedom of Information Act. The first time they looked at this data, they found the risk of autism with as little as 25 mics, 1 flu shot, was 7 to 11 times. Now we're getting close to the risk of, this is just in proportion, we're getting close to tobacco and lung cancer risk range. They modified and pulled and twisted the data until it became insignificant, and then they published it. Simpsonwood was a meeting in Norcross, Georgia that discussed the early results of this, and I have a transcript on the CD in which, illegally I might add, the CDC officials met with representatives from American Academy of Pediatrics, all the governing health agencies, private industry, drug companies are part of this conference, and it's very obvious that they knew what was going on. And just some quotes, one pediatrician with a conscience: "A number of dose-related relationships are linear. They're statistically significant. You could play with this all you want. They are linear. They are statistically significant," in an argumentative kind of frame of mind. "The risk of frequency of developmental disorders, whether it's ascertainment or real, it's much too graphic. We don't see this kind of genetic change in 30 years. One authority from Michigan left the room to call his son and say, "Don't give our grandson a vaccine." His daughter-in-law was about to deliver. One of the CDC statisticians says you can push and pull, but there's been a substantial movement from this very highly significant result down to a fairly marginal result. So they were manipulating the data as they were meeting to figure out how they could water this down. And in a bizarre twist, the primary author, when he presented one of the middle phases of the data to the Institute of Medicine, announces, "I just got hired by GlaxoSmithKline this morning." The toxicological study, and this is the only study that IOM accepted that was not epidemiological. And epidemiology is good, but it really won't even hold up in court alone. You have to have more beefy research with it. So epidemiology is weak in the grand scheme of things. Pichachero from Rochester did a study. They just measured the blood mercury levels in kids that got vaccines, infants. And they had known thresholds, and they go, well, if the mercury level we measure in the blood is below the EPA's threshold, it can't cause damage. It sounds logical. It's not a bad study. These weren't autistic kids. They don't know. They didn't follow. They were just looking at normal kids to see the physiology, essentially. Here's what they found. They found that based on their thresholds, none of these kids met the threshold. If you look in the first column, the first column, third down, the days the blood was drawn post-vaccine averaged 8 days. The first time they drew blood after a shot was 3 days. Now here's the analogy. I get pulled over for drunk driving. And I say, "Officer, it's Monday. Could you come back Thursday and get my blood alcohol?" They only looked at 17 kids. I mean, this is garbage. Absolutely garbage. And this is what the famous Institute of Medicine has accepted as definitive science. And I haven't met a pediatrician in my town that can comprehend that this paper is garbage. They read the summary and they read the press releases. They don't look at the data. This author also, in this paper, had no financial disclosures. However, 2 years ago, he had another paper, and he was basically connected to every drug vaccine manufacturer, everyone. There was also another transcript from a secret meeting that the Institute of Medicine had. And they met before they even looked at the data, and they decided that they were going to wash this under the table. The CDC asked them not to find a link, and that's what they were going to do. They were never going to go to a causation. That was their predetermined idea when they met. Interesting, who's on the executive council for the Institute of Medicine? A man named Gail Castle, the vice president of Eli Lilly. There's 20 executive council members at the Institute of Medicine. So I ask you, Eli Lilly is responsible for hundreds of $billions in liability. And don't you think he would walk down the hallway and say, Marie McCormick, how's this assessment going? You're not really going to find anything, are you? I mean, is it possible that that's not a fatal conflict in the Institute of Medicine? Second person there is Helene Gale. I'm going to talk about her a little bit later. She works for an organization called Gavi. And these are just some of these statements, Marie McCormick saying, we're not ever going to come down that the vaccines and autism is a true side effect. So this is available. It's on the, it's in courtrooms right now, but it's on the CD-ROM as well. Kathleen Stratton saying, chances are when all said and done, we're still not going to be able to say that this is a causation. Okay. Okay, what do we know about mercury? If I was trying to roll up my sleeves and say, well, let's figure out what's going on, I mean, is it possibly mercury? The first thing I would look at is what the federal officials are telling me. I mean, we have agencies that regulate toxic drugs. So the first thing I would do is find out what they're saying. Here's what the FDA said. They said that there's work going back to 1931, and they give you a bibliography of safe and effective studies. And here's a list. And I got an email from a parent once who disagreed with me and said, here's the list. Mercury's safe, see? And I sent it back and go, did you read these papers? I mean, it's like saying, here's the proof. See, it's right here. You know. Well, these papers, you know, they have nothing to do with safety. This is to do with eye drops, ear drops, preserving urine specimens from bacteria. I mean, this isn't about injecting kids. I mean, it has nothing to do with autism and ethylmercury injectant, especially in children. Here's one of the papers FDA vaunted as proving any problems. They injected rabbits. So I pulled the paper. Over half the rabbits died of mercury poisoning. The rats, it was very vague details. About 150 were injected. There were fatal cases. We don't know exactly how many. Mice and dogs, very scarce discussion. The guinea pigs came off the best. They had severe peritoneal, abdominal pain. And that's it. I mean, that's a safety study. But the worst is a paper in 1930 by Casey Smithburn. And that name's going to come up again. Remember that. This was the paper that grandfathered its use into healthcare products in 1931. Casey Smithburn was working for Eli Lilly in Indianapolis. It was an epidemic of meningitis. Some people got merthiolate, and that's ethylmercury or thimerosal. It's called merthiolate then. Some got the standard gamma globulin. Some got the gamma globulin with merthiolate. Those that got, the overall death rate was 65%. So it was, people weren't doing well. It's a weird population to study safety. If they didn't get merthiolate, they had 59%. The mortality rate was 59%. If they got merthiolate, they all died. So merthiolate, and the doses they were giving were just off the chart. You could have killed a horse with the doses they were giving. So it's not surprising they killed everybody they gave this to. The other way is just look at what the manufacturers say. The manufacturers have regulations. They have to tell their workers in their labs, manufacturing lab, here's what happens. Here's the risk of being around this stuff. And I'll read some of the key points. In animal studies, it causes mental retardation and motor coordination difficulties. In human studies, exposure in utero can cause severe to mild mental retardation, discoordination, and so forth. National Toxicology Program states this: it's a poison by ingestion, it's a carcinogen, teratogen, experimental reproductive effects. In children, it can cause mental retardation, loss of coordination and speech, writing, gait, stupor, irritability, bad temper, progressing to mania. Isn't this autism? California Proposition 65. One phrase: it's biologically plausible that thimerosal can cause adverse developmental effects. And yet, Marie McCormick at the Institute of Medicine said there's no biological possibility. There are 1,500 papers. You can't design a study that puts thimerosal into a petri dish with a cell and it doesn't destroy it. It is impossible. It does not exist. We know it crosses the blood-brain barrier. We know it crosses the placental barrier to the fetus. It is soaked up in the brain. It's concentrated in tissue. So blood testing is useless unless it's an acute poisoning. You have to measure tissue. It destroys down to the DNA level of any tissue it sees. Why do we have it in? I mean, there has to be a great reason, because this is poison. It's preserving the vials so they don't get contaminated from repeat needle injections to pull doses out in the doctor's office. But we've known for years that it doesn't work even as that. 1985, use of thimerosal can't be relied upon. These are all peer-reviewed journals. 1991, it is a weak antibacterial agent. Its role as a preservative is historical. 1977, the use of it should be heavily restricted and withdrawn. The fact that mercury is highly toxic seems to have been forgotten. The FDA 22 years ago said in over-the-counter products, that's eardrops and eye drops, it's not safe and it's not effective. And they passed a law that it should be removed, and it never was. There was no enforcement. Other evidence, initially anecdotal, is quite curious that the person who first wrote up autism, Leo Kanner, in 1943, the first child in his study was born in 1931, the same year, the first year thimerosal was used. and biological products. Coincidence? We have a database as an act of Congress called VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. It is a passive database, so if a doctor sees a bad outcome in his office, he calls or writes the CDC and fills out a form and submits it. And it's a way, and it's been validated, it's a good way. We've found a lot of problems in other vaccines using the VAERS database, even though it's passive. It represents probably less than 1% of the true incidence, for sure. Here's an example of a case of autism after the 2-month shots, DTP, Hib. Autism, fever, somnolence, this is what the doctor writes, somnolence, speech disorder, 4 days post-vaccination, running fever. He gave aspirin, and now aspirin, by the way, or Tylenol, by the way, promotes toxicity of mercury. It's the worst thing to do. It depletes glutathione, which protects the nervous cells from damage. Children lost speech and then was diagnosed with autism shortly after. Here's a physician who reported 10 cases after DTP and MMR. Let's see. We have, historically, we've been able to find problems with the rotavirus vaccine because it caused bowel obstruction, and the VAERS database showed 15 cases. Neurological events after an older version of an MMR vaccine, there were 84 cases, and Guillain-Barré, which we still see, after the swine flu vaccine, there was 382 cases reported to VAERS. This started the investigation of pulled vaccines. We have right now 800 cases of autism, and it's being ignored. I wouldn't say it's being ignored. They're producing research that says it's safe. Okay. Another anecdotal. An investigative journalist from Washington, Dan Olmsted, went to a community of Amish in Pennsylvania. 22,000 Amish. He found 3 cases of autism. 2 were vaccinated, and 1 was probably vaccinated because they were adopted from China. So we're exporting something to China. An interesting study done by a parent physician, and this makes sense. If you want to know if mercury poisoning is autism, just study all the cases of mercury poisoning and study all the cases of autism and compare the list. It's not real hard science, but it's practical and it's a place to start. There were 181 papers reviewed of either autism or known mercury poisoning, organic mercury. Not ethyl, most of these were methyl, which is very, very close chemically. The kind in fish, for example. I know you can't read this. Didn't mean you to read it. There's over 100 traits. This is physiological, biochemical, anatomical, you name it, that are common. I mean, we have some enormous similarities between mercury poisoning and autism. And these twins, just for fun, I made a list to your left of how many traits I can make anyone believe that these twins were the same thing. I came up with 18. I couldn't come up with any more traits. So over 100 common features. It's not hard science, but it's a start. Okay, so the hypothesis we really have here, we have an environmental disease model. And the fact is everyone who smokes doesn't get cancer. We know that. And not every case of cancer is from tobacco. So it's the same thing, environmental disease model. There is a genetic predisposition, and they know precisely what that is. There are biological predispositions. Aspirin or Tylenol makes it worse. Milk allergies and antibiotics will stop a child's ability to get rid of mercury. So these are things that are common in childhood. So that's why one kid might get it, and it's almost like you gave him 1,000 times that if he's on a milk diet, is on antibiotics, ear infections, and so forth. And what the mother gets also makes sense because it's environmental. So if you live in a district with high mercury in the environment, if the mom had amalgams in her mouth, if she had a lot of tuna in her diet, all those things add up. So you have a heterogeneous risk factors, a heterogeneous expression of the disease. All of this has been proven in peer review. Mothers that get amalgams have much higher risk. There's a direct correlation to what district you live in and the amount of mercury in the air. So it's been proven. Let's start with logic. And I bet you there may not be a lot of physicians here, but if I ask the question, if a kid came into you as a physician and the mom said, I think he's got heavy metal poisoning, what do you do? How do we test it? Would you give him a plane ticket to Denmark? And say, there's an epidemiology study going on. I bet you guys know the answer. You'd measure it. Is there something about these kids that they're holding on to mercury? I don't even know. I mean, AMA, AAP, I'm not sure the CDC's even responded to this. They haven't thought about it. It's been done, and it's been consistent in other studies. It's been reproducible. First study by Mark Blaxell and Amy Holmes, published in peer review. They looked at hair samples, and this is a paradox. The hair in autistic kids was tiny. Hair in kids, now these are kids that got vaccines and didn't get autism, and kids that got vaccines and didn't. So basically the same, they were exposed to the same amount. Why did one kid get autism, one kid not? And the answer is right here. Hair manifests in what your body can excrete. And this is the same thing in Alzheimer's. The risk factor of Alzheimer's and amalgams in your mouth. Autistic kids can't get rid of it, so it's not in their hair. It's in their brain. To prove that, you give them a chelating agent. By the way, the lower their hair mercury, the more autistic they were, the more severe. Perfect correlation. Okay. To prove that, you give them a chelating agent, which is a chemical that goes through the body, scavenges up, pulls mercury out of tissue, and dumps it in the urine and stool. So you can measure what the body burden is. You take those same kids that don't have it in their hair, give them a chelating agent, and just 6 hours measure their urine 4 or 5-fold higher. So they're retaining it compared to the kids that are neurotypical. They have a lot in their hair, none in their urine. Now what's amazing is these kids generally don't even start excreting it with the chelation for several months. So if you did a 6-month study, which you wouldn't do because you'd have to give normal kids this stuff, it's going to be thousands and thousands times higher. There's just no question. And this is profound science. I'm not going to talk about biochemistry, just to say the biochemical pathways have been discovered. I sat in a congressional hearing last year. 2 of the major papers being presented, it proved, and it makes sense, you drop mercury, vaccine mercury in a petri dish and measure the biochemistry inside these cells. And then you do mercury biochemistry testing in the children and compare them, they're identical. What's happening biochemically is the same thing. And so it is literally a perfect match. Now, why didn't the CDC, well, how'd they respond? They responded, this FDA was there too, they got up and they left the room before the data was presented. They refused to hear. So they can say, you know, we've never seen any research that's changed our mind. I mean, so they're not lying. Epidemiology, there are 7 studies by the Geyers that prove it. 4 different databases, including the VSD database that was washed down. The more mercury kids get, the higher risk for autism, speech disorders, and unfortunately, sudden death, cardiac death. Mercury is toxic to the autonomic nervous system, and these children are at much higher risk for cardiac events later in life. The VSD database they got a hold of that the CDC said there was no link. They found a relative risk of 27, with only 75 mics difference between the low exposure and the high exposure risk. We don't know what the relative risk is between somebody who never got it and somebody who got the full dose. It's probably just off the chart. And the good news is it's reversible. I have seen, and very, very many people, you know, it's strange for me to say that nobody believes this, but I've been to conferences now for 3 years. I've taken training courses myself, and I've talked to hundreds of parents. They can pull mercury out of the body with chelation agents. They can do this nutritionally. They can turn on those biochemical pathways that are plugged up. And this is a sample. This is a doctor's son who became autistic when his wife, they were going through a divorce proceeding. His wife wanted to vaccinate. He didn't. He got shots, became autistic. This is his hair analysis showed very low mercury. He was treated, and you can see that the first profile on the top, a little bit of mercury. A few weeks later, mercury off the chart. And this went on for 6 months. When finally the mercury started coming down, he checked every few weeks. He started speaking. So it is reversible. And there are a lot of ways to do it. Well, what's going on? I mean, why doesn't the American Academy of Pediatrics know this answer? I can give you some enlightenment, because I went to their meeting a few months ago. Actually, I think it was October. This is what I discovered about the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I'm not picking just on them alone. I think I'm a radiologist. I'm sure that our societies are influenced by industry, no question. But this is just an example. I mean, I'm really in a dilemma. I just really want to know. I can't even talk to pediatricians I've known in my hometown. They're so turned off by the concept, they're violent with me. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. Now, I've convinced a couple, but not many. This is a trade organization, and their annual revenues in their last annual statement, $67 million. Less than a quarter of that is from dues. They did list, there are some evidence of corporate donors. One report in '97 said they got $2 million from vaccine manufacturers, $1 million from formula makers, And here's their top donor list, a charitable circle, and you can see, and it's like, I think to be in this club you have to be $25,000 or above, so it could be millions. Now I've got to count for, you know, $50, $60 million that is not from fees from doctors. All the vaccine manufacturers are in this circle, and 3 of the companies that sell drugs for ADD, ADHD are in this, so it's big business for both of them. Here's where they make their coin. Special support projects, millions of dollars, endowments, over $4 million, grants and contributions, many corporations are in this circle. So they're really a small organization that can be corrupted when they represent the masses and when there's the opportunity to make bad decisions for financial gain. I made a list of the speakers at this conference, and there were 2 tracks. There were people talking on vaccine safety, and there were people talking about how to treat autism, ADHD. I was curious what these speakers' backgrounds were. Here's the ones that spoke on vaccine safety. This is what they claimed as conflicts. The majority either got speaker fees, were consultants, research support, or grants from drug companies. Those that didn't, most of them worked for the CDC. 2 of them were in the Simpsonwood meeting that were trying to change the data. So only 1 of them I couldn't find a conflict on, and 1 who listed no conflict is a patent holder for the rotavirus vaccine. And he's been funded by Merck for over 12 years. But he listed no. So I'm walking in. My impression is that this is the marketing limb of the drug companies wearing a physician coat. That's what I'm seeing. They're not hearing any of the evidence I just showed you. Those that spoke on ADD, ADHD were even more conflicted. One guy had 42 relationships with 14 companies. I mean, when does he practice? I mean, this is unbelievable. And an example, Margaret Reynolds, who sits on the advisory committee at the CDC, gets paid by every drug manufacturer. And she's sitting there to give advice on how to set the vaccine schedule. And this is not isolated to vaccines. This is pervasive in all aspects of medicine. And in other fields, I'm sure. The CDC spends $1 billion to promote vaccines and $30 million to look at the safety. You can see that they are not really putting a lot of money in safety. One study that was a congressional investigation of conflicts of interest in advanced vaccine manufacturers, and this is on the disc, it was done in 2000, Dan Burton's committee, House Reform Committee. They found that 4 of 8 CDC advisory committee members who voted to approve the rotavirus vaccine had financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry that were actually developing the vaccine, not just any pharmaceutical, the company that was making the vaccine, over half of them. 2 of them had patents. Now, it's just, why isn't this on the front page of the newspapers? It's, you can sit there and you can vote on something that's going to reap millions of dollars for you. Even if you think you're honest and you're an expert, you don't think you'd be biased? Their contracts they had with the CDC were long-term. The conflicts were often not supported. And the FDA, it's the same thing. This was a paper that occurred in USA Today. Half the experts hired by the FDA on the advisory committees had financial ties. They had over 800 waivers. The FDA granted over 800 waivers on disclosing conflicts. 92% of the advisory committees had at least 1 member with a conflict of interest. So, duh. It's not better in Washington. It's the drug lobby is the #1 drug lobby, even more than the insurance company. And these are old statistics. $235 million in lobbying, $34 million in campaign contributions, almost 70% to the Republican Party. What do we know about the pharmaceutical industry? They're not hurting. No matter what they want to show you on the news, that they're struggling. They really need protection in Congress so they don't get sued. They are #1 in Fortune 500, huge profits, and no question about it. This is the best single statement that really summarizes what we're facing. Article by Shannon Brownlee, Washington Monthly. When industry has penetrated every level of medicine, from the lab bench to the FDA advisory panels, from the pages of the medical journals to your doctor's prescription pad, how are physicians to make decisions about treating their patients? And that is so true. That is perfect. Well, the failure of American healthcare was spelled out by Gary Null. Dr. Stan has, I think, his book here. #1 cause of death in the United States isn't heart disease or cancer, it's medicine. Need more truth? We spent $1.6 trillion in 2002. That's more even per GDP than any other nation on the face of the planet. What do we get? We're 21st in life expectancy. We're 22nd in infant mortality. Now, infant mortality, this is old statistics. Last 2 years, it rose for the first time in over 40 years. The CIA keeps separate statistics. We rank in the 40s of both of these. We don't rank as high because they added more nations. So this makes us look good. They threw out some of the smaller nations that had better health care. I don't know. I mean, I'm a physician, and I was very proud to go to medical school and help people. But I'll tell you what, we used to make fun of people that couldn't get into American health care. You know, we'd laugh in school. We say they got to go to some foreign country and get their education. Ha ha. I'm thinking, you know what? The joke's on us. It really is on us because you don't. You know, we're so used to judging healthcare, the success by, you know, how fast is your hospital growing? You know, our hospitals have been in construction since the day I took a job. Physicians are making a lot of money. Our salaries are. I'm working part-time, and I don't even. You know, it's enormous what we're doing. Our volume is enormous, but we're overpaid. I'd rather work. You know, wouldn't you rather live in a world where doctors are broke? I mean, that's how we should judge healthcare. We want our libraries to expand, not our hospitals, and we don't want our special ed classes to expand. And that's what we're getting. And we're sold on the fact that medicine in America is second to none, and that's just it's a deception. Well, let's investigate. And that's what I did. I'm not a treating doctor. And I did lobby in Illinois, and we got a really strict bill passed, the most strict in the nation. California beat us in time, but ours is much strict. And they're not compliant with it, by the way, so we're still trying to figure out why they haven't ordered the thimerosal-free vaccines for January. But because I'm not treating, and I just, you know, and I learned about Dr. Stan. He taught me a lot. I decided that, you know, there's probably more to this than meets the eye. And so I think inside I'm an investigative journalist. I mean, I hate writing, but so that's my approach. And let's look at the theories. Theory number one, and this is answering the question, why is there mercury in vaccines? Why? It's mind-boggling. Why are we injecting this in our kids? Well, number one, it's safe. You know, the science is really, the garbage science is really not garbage. The Institute of Medicine is correct. It's safe and effective. And that's a terrible theory. That's just not true. Any legitimate science will look at these mountains of data and know what's going on. It's the mercury. Okay, the oops theory. And this is widely believed in my circles. And I'm kind of in a fringe group, and I'm sort of fringe of this fringe. So this is like really the only audience I feel comfortable with, because I gave a small version of this talk in Chicago in the spring, and it was to mothers. Mostly parents of autistic children. And afterwards, a mom came up to me and she said, well, that was really great. I think you did a wonderful job. It was very insightful. I'm going to go home now and throw myself in front of a bus. And I thought, oh, man, I got to be careful about who I am. And so I know that you're a savvy group, and you've probably passed that point, you know, that things are so gloomy, and I think you are mature enough to take this. I hope anyway. My attorney just left, so so the oops theory is the healthcare agencies didn't really mean to harm anybody, but they figured it out too. They go, whoops. We know it is. We got to cover it up because we want to protect our profits. We want to reduce liability. We got to protect our livelihood. And this has been, you know, the Geyers have confirmed this. I mean, they spoke in Chicago this spring, and David and Mark Geyer, researchers, former CDC researchers, that still try to pry into their databases. You can't convince the CDC this was right. Do you know why? They already know it. They told me they know it. They told me they know it. That's what they said. They told me they know it. You can't convince somebody who knows the truth that it's the truth, right? Einstein, I think, said something like, the same entity that created the problem can't solve the problem. And I think that's basically what we're faced with. Congressman Dave Weldon from Florida said this in a meeting in Chicago last year. The litigation would be gigantic. The settlements will be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of careers will be sullied. I don't know what sullied means, but I think it's bad. Some careers will be ruined, destroyed, never recovered. Here's the key, in my opinion. Here's the key statement. The AMA just fell over themselves with this IOM paper. They thought this was the greatest research in the world. And this is just one of their quotes, but it's I think, very relevant. Quote, the IOM report released today provides reassurance to patients and physicians and will allow them to focus on other medical needs, safe in the knowledge that vaccines they received are indeed safe and that the mechanisms to monitor continued safety in the U.S. are working. Now that means if the IOM said that it was the vaccines, it was the mercury in vaccines, what the AMA is telling you, guess what? If we may have been wrong and you can't be assured and the mechanisms in the United States are not working, then do you think they would ever admit that? No. There's problems with this theory anyway, and most people, like I said, believe that this is just a cover you're behind type of approach. Problem number one, the CDC, with support from the American Academy of Pediatrics, has now increased the exposure to kids. After taking it out from 99 to 03, in 04 they go, you know what, we have to mandate flu vaccines now in the 6 to 23-month-olds. Before it was elective, only high-risk kids. You know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The American Academy, or the OB-GYN Association, ACOG, also is really pushing the flu vaccine in pregnancy. And now they're saying not only pregnancy, but we're giving it in any trimester, first trimester. They're promoting it big time. I've talked to OB-GYNs. And again, remember, the fetus second trimester is going to get 250 times the EPA dose. Now, I'm writing a paper, and this is like about the first really proprietary contribution to the field. I'm submitting it for publication in 2 weeks. I know everything about the science to the flu vaccine in pregnancy, and it's an amazing story. But let's just say this, that the safety studies are absent, and I'll show you one of those a little bit later. The other problem with this theory is that Chiron, who makes flu vaccines, last year, their whole factory in Europe got contaminated, and it had mercury in it as a preservative. Now, this cost the company millions of dollars, and wouldn't you think that as a CEO, you're going, well, next year let's put mercury back in it. Now, if they ever need an excuse to get mercury out, and you were thinking, a lot of people thought if they just had an excuse to take it out, they wouldn't say, it wouldn't look like they're taking it out because of autism. Oh, we're taking it out because it doesn't work. And they didn't. So that's odd that there was no legislative, regulatory response to this, other than, well, let's use it again. Another thing that blows that theory is a statement that was actually, I just found out a hacker broke into their website. But they're sort of official on this anyway. The World Health Organization made a statement in 2002 that they were going to develop a strong advocacy campaign for the ongoing use of thimerosal exporting overseas. They're going to lobby ministers of health and senior regulators. And it was a very integral part of their plan, their marketing plan. So it brings me to intent. It seems like that there may be some intent here. So let's just, it's unbelievable to think, but let's just think, what are the possibilities? Number one, is it for profit? And a lot of people buy that. It's Machiavellianism, right? Eli Lilly made, I think in 2004, 666, interesting number, isn't it? I see a lot of these numbers. $666 million on Strattera, which is the drug that treat ADHD. They make money when they sell the cause for the illness. They make money when they treat the illness. Machiavellianism. Len Horowitz, in his book Death in the Air, really kind of summed this up. Creating a problem prompts the economic opportunity for a solution. In today's global health arena, there is great incentive to manufacture health and environmental problems, have mainstream media herald them, thereby inducing anxiety, even hysteria, which leads to mass consumption of expensive chemical or pharmaceutical solutions. That sounds like the bird flu, doesn't it? And remember, the clinical practice guidelines recommend 18 different drugs that can be used for ADHD. No biomedical therapy. 85% of the physicians that write clinical practice guidelines have contracts with drug companies. And these are the most important peer-reviewed papers in medicine. Actually, they're not peer-reviewed. They're just summary papers. Okay, so it could be for profit, and I can't really prove it. I mean, the system is in place that would benefit them to create disease. It's unthinkable. But there's still one other area we have to consider, and that's population control or genocide. And what evidence do we have? Now, it's a huge topic. Dr. Stan has written a great short treatment of that, Population Control Agenda. I've included on the disc a paper called Inherent Racism of Population Control. I'm not sure Dr. Stan has seen that paper. It's a short paper also, but excellent. This is maybe a case of hello pot, this is kettle. This is what the United Nations considers genocide. Killing of members of a group causing serious bodily harm. Also, though, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within that group. This is Article 2 of, well, these numbers are small here, Resolution 96. Okay, well, is thimerosal a candidate to be a population control agent? It would have to, in theory, here's what we need. It would have to, we know it reduces the likelihood of consummation. That children are affected, social problems obviously would less likely be married and have children. But does it reduce fertility, or worse, is it an abortifactic? This is a study by Gerhard in 1998. They looked at basically women who couldn't get pregnant, had repeated miscarriages, and they found of those that were in the hormonal category had over twice the average amount of mercury in their urine than those in other categories. So there was a suggestion here that higher mercury, the higher rates of miscarriage. It was related to amalgams. The more amalgams they got, the more mercury was showing up in their post-provocative urines when they gave them that chelation challenge. It's the same for males. Hong Kong subfertile males, they found a direct correlation between the number of sperm and the amount of mercury that was measured in seminal vesicle fluid. Not only were the number down, but the activity, the motion was down. They weren't functioning as well, and they had more abnormalities. So it is potential. The best way to answer that question is look at other generations that got exposed to mercury, and this is a good group, and not in that sense, but Pink's disease was mercury poisoning occurred mostly in United Kingdom and Australia and some in Canada from mercury-containing teething powder in the 20s, 30s, 40s. And this is an article I read, and it kind of fell off the floor when I read it. And Daly, Society for Social History of Medicine, an article about Pink's disease victims, saying, meanwhile, the cause having been identified and accepted, Pink's disease disappeared, but its consequences emerged much later in an unexpected quarter as a cause of male infertility. I got a survey from a woman who runs the largest Pink's disease support group in Australia and found that miscarriages, infertility in male and females, and stillbirths were between 1.5 and 3.5 times more likely in people that had mercury poisoning Pink's disease. One disease completely disappeared after the calomel lotion, the teething lotion, was removed, and that's Young's disease. And this is a triad of sinusitis, airway infections, and obstruction of the small tubules in the seminal vesicles in fertile males. That entity, uncommon as it was, just disappeared from the records after they took this out. So scientists and physicians finally had to admit that, yeah, this was due to mercury poisoning. We called this unknown syndrome for years. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? All the regulatory agencies consider mercury a potential genocide agent, population control agent. This is two statements I showed earlier: mental retardation, developmental toxin, intrauterine deaths, perinatal deaths, other congenital malformations. Now this is the level of deception that is just everywhere. This is a list I showed you earlier, these 8 papers that have nothing to do with injecting mercury into kids. I looked at it again, and there were 2 papers that were interesting. And now this is a list of papers that the FDA is saying, here's the proof of safety. That's important. This isn't just a list of floating. This is their evidence that mercury is safe. Let's look at these 2 papers. Journal of Pharmacology, 1990, scientists put a little thimerosal on the trachea of sheep. And the trachea have these little hairs called cilia. They're very important for reproductive function. After 40 to 100 minutes, the cilia died. Here's one place the cilia are, male sperm. Here's another place, the fallopian tubes in the female reproductive system. So we have a biological mechanism, don't we? The other paper, interesting, this was published in 1975. They looked at the effect of mercury in pregnant animals, which you would think that any regulatory agency should do. And by the way, the flu vaccine, if you pull the manufacturer's sheet, they'll say has not been tested in pregnant animals or humans. We don't know. But we're recommending injecting it into pregnant humans. But that's what the manufacturing sheet says, the inserts. Here's what they found. When they concluded, it's sort of funny, they said there's no birth defects. And if you read just a summary, that's all you would know. It doesn't cause birth defects. But the reason it doesn't, because the animals died. The infants died before they were born. There was a 14 to 36 time higher death rate in rabbits. I guess that's not really what they meant when the rabbit died. I don't think they had that in mind. and threefold deaths of rats just dropping it in the peritoneal cavity. This wasn't even injecting it. And I have to tell you that this is thimerosal. Mercury in a vaccine is worse because it contains adjuvants like aluminum. And aluminum makes mercury much more deadly. So most of these clinical studies are just for the preservative, and that's an underestimate of the toxicity. Look at the VAERS database, which we've relied on in the past, and abortion. Nobody's published the data on this, and I had to search this myself for my paper I'm writing. Here's a case of the flu shot. It was given to a 19-year-old. She had an abortion in 2 days. After, it could be a coincidence, of course. You don't make much conclusion over one paper. Here's another one, hepatitis B vaccine given in pregnancy caused an abortion. So what I did find, I didn't put it here, what I did find were 11 cases of abortions with the flu vaccine. Now you have to understand this is an underestimation because the coverage rate for pregnant women is less than 1%. I mean, it's way smaller. And the reporting is less than 1%. So the VAERS was set up for complications of childhood vaccine problems when 70, 90% of the kids get the vaccines. So 11 cases in pregnant women who are hardly getting vaccines is an enormous number. If you look at the other vaccines given, I found over 200 cases of abortions given in pregnancy. So it's unthinkable that any obstetrician could give any kind of vaccine to a pregnant woman when it hasn't been tested. And we've got some evidence that it causes abortions. Okay, and the next step in this discovery is, I think thimerosal is a candidate, but what's the U.S. policy? Do the U.S. have a policy on population control? And this is where our story gets really, really strange. Okay, this is the Rockefeller Commission report. Some of you may know this stuff. Rockefeller, in March of '72, concluded the 2-year study, and he was asked by Nixon. A committee was formed, I think it was called the Zero Population Growth Committee. He was president of the Population Council. Nixon appointed him head of this committee, and he said, study the population issues in the U.S. and let us know what our futures are going to be economically with regards to overpopulation or population growth. Here's what Rockefeller said to Nixon. After 2 years of concentrated effort, we have concluded that in the long run, no substantial benefits will result from further growth of the nation's population. Blah, blah, blah. Key statement. By its very nature, population is a continuing concern and should receive continuing attention. Later generations and later commissions will be able to see the right path further into the future. Key phrase. In any case, no generation needs to know the ultimate goal of the final means, only the direction in which they will be found. So we have a pretty high-level document in America saying that, you know what, you got population problems, we need to do something about it, and no, you don't have to tell the American people. Key document number 2, and this is probably, I still shake my head at this, this may be the most notorious document in the history of the United States. And I'll show you why. It's the National Security Study Memorandum 200, Kissinger report, who was the director of the NSC and Secretary of State, submitted this document to Nixon in '74, I think, just a couple years after the Rockefeller Commission report. Now it's interesting, Kissinger was a protege of Rockefeller. He came up through the ranks and was assisted a great deal, so I'm told. It was declassified in '89, so it was top secret for several years. The focus was, again, population growth, but on the international scene, and mostly economic, not social. Their conclusions were this, and you can guess the conclusions. Growth rates are unprecedented. The lesser developed countries are growing much faster than our nations. This will threaten the U.S. imports. It will threaten our national stability. And we have to do something immediately. The tone of the document is 200 pages plus, was urgent. We have to do something now. It's critical. The sky is falling. Their goals were to have a replacement fertility in developing countries in 1985, and replacement fertility in the lesser developed countries by 2000. So they're actually going to take their program to developed countries first, and then export it to the lesser developed countries. It doesn't make sense because they're more concerned, but I think my interpretation now, knowing what I'm going to tell you next, is I think they needed to be a home base, work out this place where they had control, rather than go to a foreign land and try to work out how they're going to instill propaganda to reduce population. Let's work in our home territory. We control the media. We control the healthcare system. That was probably what they were thinking. They identified target nations they were going to use. They wanted to enlist multinational organizations. Legalize abortion was key. Financial incentives, propaganda, and even coercion were going to be used. The activities must not appear coercive, however. We must emphasize individual rights so they don't know what they're getting. Reproductive health was piggybacked to other general health issues, so they can take that pill of poison, and it looked, from some angles, not like poison. But look at this. They were going to emphasize sex education, women equality, daycare, improving Social Security so you won't need as many kids to help you when you retire. These are kind of the social issues that we faced for the last 50 years. Did it come out of this document? I mean, these aren't really social issues. These were government issues under the guise of social movements. Seems like that's plausible. This is a great quote from a not-so-great man, Fidel Castro, and I think this summarizes, what the United States frame of mind was then. The solutions put forth by imperialism are the quintessence of simplicity. When they speak of the problems of population and birth, they are in no way moved by concepts related to the interests of family or of society. Just when science and technology are making incredible advances in all fields, they resort to technology to suppress revolutions and to ask the help of science to prevent population growth. In short, the peoples are not to make revolutions, and women are not to give birth. This sums up the philosophy of imperialism. That's an amazing quote. Well, we have another obvious question. Yeah, there's national and global population control policies, no question. Have they been implemented? The first I heard about this organization was this article by Lisa Regan, and I talked to her on the phone when she wrote this. She was talking about vaccines, politics, and mercuries, and she just tripped into the global scene by mentioning that one of these committee members, the IOM committee members, was a member of Gavi, something called an organization called Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. She told me she had black helicopters flying over her house for 3 weeks after that. And her article was a great article, but it wasn't that much different than Dave Kirby's book or other good scattered journalistic pieces across the country. But she really triggered something when she stepped into this international arena. Let's look at Gavi a little bit closer. Who are they? Their goals, it's an organization which has encompassed all the international efforts for the last 50 years, 60 years plus, to immunize the world. This was an earlier initiative, and I think the first initiative I found was 1974. UN had a program called the Expanded Program for Immunization. It went through various revisions, and it became a children's vaccine initiative in 1990. Same players, just a different organizing head. So Gavi is an organizing head of the current, the movement of the day, of all the organizations and governments that are pushing back vaccination. Now I'm going to say population control. Vaccination to the third world. On the surface, there's nothing here about population control. This is, let's better the world. Their goals are to vaccinate, and this is all they do. They don't provide cod liver oil. They don't provide water, sanitation, crop, This is vaccines. This is what they do. They want to improve the health of the poorest 70th nations by vaccination, every aspect, development, implementation, and so forth. They were launched in '99 by Bill Gates with $750 million. They have over $5 billion committed. A $4 billion commitment was just given this fall in September by several European nations. Their goal is 12 to 15 billion. So this isn't chump change. This is a serious organization. They want to give the usual vaccines to third world, some of the ones we don't get here, yellow fever and so forth. Oral polio, which we no longer give, and any future developing vaccines, rotavirus, HIV, and so forth. This is from their website. They're comprised of government agencies in both countries, so it's bilateral, developing governments and developed governments. NGOs, World Health Organization, UNICEF, World Bank, private organizations like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and industry, the vaccine manufacturers. Now this list looks familiar. I've seen this somewhere before. Here's the NSSM statement. Here's who they said they were going to use 30 years ago to reduce population. World Bank, World Health, UNICEF, UN Population Fund, donor countries, private groups, etc. It's the same thing. Maybe a wild coincidence. But the trouble is, these two organizations are doing something that's completely opposite. NSM 200 wants to reduce the population somehow. Gavi wants to increase the population, or so it would seem. Doesn't good health promote growth? I mean, you would think. I mean, if you can't feed yourself, why would you want 10 kids? Makes sense. But, well, let's look at Gavi a little closer. They have supporting nations, and there's the list, USA, Canada, and the Anglo-European countries. It's an Anglo organization. And the recipient nations are, I would say, non-Anglo for the most part. And the money we're talking, Uganda, 92 million, Nigeria, 81 million. So there's some big money. And in fact, Nigeria, I will say, was number one on the list for NSSM. They were really concerned about growth in Nigeria, leading Africa. So it doesn't surprise me that Gavi is vaccinating the heck out of Nigeria. Comparing the target lists, NSSM, their targets, for Gavi, their recipients. The list isn't identical, but this is 30 years apart. So it's similar. I think no one would argue it's a similar list of third world countries. Now, NSSM picked 13 nations. Gavi, they want them all, 70 poor nations. This is right out of the NSSM document. How is NSM going to do it, and is this what Gavi's doing? That's a good question. Quote, the U.S. also proposed to join with other developed nations in an international collaborative effort of research in human reproduction and fertility control, covering big medical and socioeconomic factors. The U.S. further offered to collaborate with other interested donor countries and organizations, and they list World Health, UN Population Fund, World Bank, UNICEF, to encourage further action by lesser developed country governments. So they were going to do some research, science. The methods of NSSM, they wanted it to be inexpensive and safe. They wanted it to be perceived as safe, for sure. Non-physician, which means they wanted to implement this to huge populations and not enough doctors to do it. And vaccines are perfect for that. You don't have to be a physician in these countries to vaccinate. There were no ideal methods in 1974. The NSSM agreed that we don't have the right stuff to do it. It's going to take research. The usual methods would be implemented until then: birth control, mechanical, like condoms, IUDs, rhythm technique, sterilization, ovulation disruption methods, chemically. But this thing just jumped off the page. This is from NSSM 25, 30 years ago. Injectable contraceptives for women which are effective for 3 months or more. Didn't exist back then. It sounds like a vaccine, potentially. Next question, does Gavi partners, what are their backgrounds? So we're really kind of looking at Gavi now. I mean, they're in my radar. Are these the NSSM 200 folks? So let's take a close look at who are the members. Bill Gates, what do we know? He has donated billions of dollars to abortion. And this is just some of that, but one of those jumps off the page, $2.2 billion to UN Population Fund on February 11th. That's 2/11/99. If you follow occult numerology, I've been seeing it every day. It's everywhere. So he's donated a lot. For a man who wants to improve health, he doesn't seem to have a respect for life. Here's a quote from the Seattle PI Reporter on Bill Gates. An interest in family planning brought the Gateses to the door of a Seattle nonprofit firm called PATH, Program for Appropriate Technology and Health. PATH has spent years working on population reproductive health and vaccine safety. Should those be in the same sentence? To the third world, nonetheless. That's what PATH was doing. Another quote, and this is Bill Gates talking, and I can just see how nervous he was when he was asked by this reporter. Vaccination campaigns often run into this question: is there some hidden agenda, something wrong with it? Even in the United States, you'll often see articles about the anti-vaccine crowd, and the awful thing is that you can scare people away, and in many cases, even the rich countries, you've ended up with a lack of coverage that has ended up in children dying. So somebody brought that up. This I just got email last week. The Gates Foundation funds a organization, $1 million, to an Indian organization that acts as a labor union for prostitutes, according to the federal agency documents. And I'm reminded of the Bible verse, wherefore by their fruits you shall know them. So other members of Gavi I won't talk about, but there's two excellent sources on the disc: UN Population Fund and United Nations Children Fund, UNICEF. In a word, coercive population control. Coercive reproductive, coercive abortion, coercive sterilization. It's just too big of an issue to tackle, but the allegations and the support of that is here. World Bank. Why are bankers involved with this? I think this, and again, it's a huge topic. World Bank is a big issue. One quote from an article written by a journalist from New York in the Reporters Collective, and this is on the disc too. Very hard to find. I had to go to the internet and go through archives to find it because the website disappeared, but there's hundreds of articles on this. It has been a matter of general understanding for years that population control policies, government directives, and actions to prevent births are made a condition for development, lending, and economic assistance. So you can guess why the bank is there. They're there to give incentives to nations who will agree to introduce population control measures, and they're there to restrict benefits in times of crisis, like famines. So there's a certain opportunity for coercion. There's one player missing from Gavi. Wasn't listed on the vaccine fund, but it was implied in the journalism piece I read. This is from an article from, again, Seattle newspaper. The Rockefeller Foundation is a member of Gavi. Now, I haven't been a disciple of Dr. Stan's sources for that many years, so I really didn't know much about the Rockefellers other than they had a nice home in Manhattan. Here's an article that Gates quotes the Rockefellers, and this is Rockefeller University News and Press. Gates says that taking our lead and our inspiration from work already done by the Rockefeller Foundation, our foundation actually started Gavi. He also praised the Rockefeller family's century of philanthropy, saying, it seems like every new corner we turn, the Rockefellers are already there, and in some cases they have been there for a long, long time. I was doing some research on Casey Smithburn, who was the scientist in 1931 that did the thimerosal study in Indianapolis who killed all the patients. And I found, when I was Googling, I found that his records were stored in the Rockefeller archives. So I went to their website, and it turns out he was a Rockefeller scientist. It's interesting that the Rockefellers, who are now funding vaccine programs, who have written the Rockefeller Commission report, basically were involved with the research that introduced mercury in vaccines. And you can see the little splash screen on the right here. J.D. Rockefeller III established a population council in 1952 and played a leading role in the efforts to bring the problem of overpopulation to global attention. A lot of coincidences. On the same website, there's Casey Smithburn's papers. And by the way, a law firm in Texas subpoenaed these, got the boxes, and the years of the thimerosal studies are missing from these. So, a little splash screen came out, 1911, interesting year. Peyton Rouse, a scientist at the Rockefeller Institute of Medical Research, discovered that viruses can cause cancer. And he got the Nobel Prize in another interesting year, 1966. And we have SV40 in polio vaccine contamination issues. Who was the first scientist that discovered viruses can cause cancer? A Rockefeller scientist. 14 members of the Institute of Medicine are currently associated with the Rockefeller University. This is from the Rockefeller website. National Academies tells you that at present 33 faculty of Rockefeller University are elected members of the U.S. National Academies of Science, which include Institute of Medicine. So we have this kind of very close relationship between the Rockefellers and the Institute of Medicine that looked at all these vaccine safety issues. Of course, the Rockefellers were instrumental in starting the national academies. Next obvious question. Since Gavi's public interest is apparently counter to population growth, is there a hidden agenda, which means, are there anti-fertility vaccines? Now, we know mercury is a candidate, but I can't tell you there's the motivation. Now, this blew me away. How many people know that there are sterilizing, abortion, anti-fertility vaccines? Has anyone heard of those? I mean, and you're a savvy crowd. I mean, you guys are on the edge of a lot of stuff. I guarantee you, I mean, I can go to a medical conference. Who's heard this? I went to PubMed, which searches for journals. I just put in a general term, birth control vaccine. I found 450 papers. There are thousands of papers on birth control vaccines, and they've been in use. They're not available at the corner drugstore. There's a textbook, one of many textbooks on it, medical text. There are journalistic pieces that are trying to combat this. And this is mostly the pro-life crowd that knows about this stuff, it seems. And there's even a medical journal and a medical society in reproductive immunology. These I took from published peer-reviewed papers on who's funding some of this research in anti-fertility vaccines. Here they are: Rockefeller Foundation, Population Council, Population Council. Here's a review article in 1991 in Human Reproduction. World Health Organization Task Force on Vaccines for Fertility Regulation. I circled it was established in 1972. When was the Rockefeller Commission report published? 1972. NSSM, 1974. So it seems like they already had in mind what they were going to do. That's the implication. Here's who's doing research on immunosuppressive vaccines. Population Council of New York, big time, millions and millions of dollars. Special program in human reproduction at World Health. A big one in New Delhi, NII, that's the National Institute of Immunology, Dr. Talwar. CONRAD, which is a research and development organization in Norfolk, Virginia, and the NIH. Those are the big players. And there are others, small universities scattered here. Ohio State's one of them. And of course, when you read these articles on birth control vaccines, they're basically saying the same stuff. You know, the world's too crowded. They're not saying this is for sophisticated women who want to have, you know, long-term, intermediate-term, one-shot-fits-all sort of thing. They're intending this for developing countries. That's what the research is selling this as. The trouble is with that kind of a policy, who's going to run this program? Hopefully not Margaret Sanger, because she made this statement, and that's typical of thinking of a great number of people. More children from the fit, less from the unfit. This is the chief issue of birth control. So who's going to run this program? Great potential for abuse. A little bit of science, if I could. This blows me away. The targets are the reproductive hormones. And antibodies, in case you don't know, is the innate immune system's ability to destroy something. There are proteins in the body that will find out something that's foreign, attack it, and destroy it. So the goal is to try to get the body to attack its own hormones and disrupt pregnancy. The path, from top to bottom, the brain sends a hormone to the pituitary gland, which sits at the base of the skull, sends signals to the testicles or ovaries, and those organs produce testosterone and estrogen and progesterone and so forth. So if you interrupt any of that cycle, you're going to mess up fertility. You can mess up pregnancy by the same system, but you can also attack something called HCG. Now, you all have heard of the positive pregnancy test. You do a urine or a blood test. That's a hormone called a human gonadotropin hormone, HCG. That's produced initially by the fetus in the early days. During fertilization in the fallopian tube, the fetus secretes a little bit of HCG. It readies the endometrium for implantation. And a radiologist talking about this is like, you know, I had to pull out my own, you know, textbooks I had put in storage. It's implanted in the uterus, and then the implantation site really kicks up the hormone, and that's when it's measurable in the blood and urine. So if you can disrupt that process, you actually, one great advantage from a diabolical standpoint is the woman won't even know she was pregnant. She won't even miss a cycle. So theoretically, it would be the stealth vaccine. The studies have been around and very successful, well, reasonably successful, but what really bothers me, you can't just inject HCG into a human because the body knows, you know, it's okay, it's not my HCG, but it's not foreign enough. You have to make it more foreign to the body. So they attach it to some other carrier, and so when the immune system attacks the carrier, it'll also boost the immune system, and it'll eventually attack the HCG, learn how to recognize the foreign HCG. They have linked it to a couple carriers, and that's diphtheria and tetanus. Now, the trouble with those things is those are in vaccines anyway. So what you have, if it works, you have a great explanation. I mean, if you send tetanus vaccine to the third world and you have some recognition of this problem, then you could say, oh, well, that was our anti-fertility vaccine industry, and they must have shipped the wrong stuff or something. So it has the ability for abuse by using antigens that are already out there, carrier proteins. This was published in 1988 in The Lancet. It was a successful phase 1 study sponsored by the World Health Organization. It was done in, I think, India and a few other nations. It worked pretty well. It required multiple shots. That's the problem with this. And most of these HCG vaccines, you have to give these tetanus boosters 3 to 5 times. And that's, you know, a little obvious. And only was effective 70% of the time, and it tended to dwindle over time. But here's what really fell out of the chair. I don't know how I found this. God has brought information to me. I don't know how it gets there, but it does. So this was a week earlier in Lancet. Maybe I picked up the wrong journal. I don't know. This was in a little editorial column in the same Lancet a few weeks earlier. the title of this article is A Well-Managed Controversial Population Policy. And they go on to say that there's this policy in Nigeria, they're trying to reduce population, they're running out of resources, they're growing too fast, yada, yada, yada. Last paragraph says this: during the recent national immunization campaign, vaccination for childhood diseases and tetanus toxoid for pregnant women, in some villages women escaped and hid in the bushes thinking they were going to be given an injection to stop them from having children. What a coincidence. There are well-documented allegations of abuse with tetanus HCG in Nicaragua, Mexico, and the Philippines. So well documented that the Department of Health in the Philippines investigated this. They found that 20% of the vials they tested were positive for HCG. The World Health said, oh, it's just a contaminant. They found this out because they had a program for tetanus to pregnant women and young women, only girls, when 70% of the cases of tetanus are in men. And they were giving them tetanus shots 3 times the first month, 5 times the first year. We get a tetanus shot in the United States once every 12 months, or sorry, once every 10 years. 10 years. So it looked funny. Even to the Philippines, they go, something's not right here. It was a subject of a BBC film, a documentary, and I met Sister Mary Pilar Versosa, a wonderful woman. I met her in Chicago this year to hear the story. They gave it to young women, and the women had fouled up fertility cycles. They had vaginal bleeding, serious complications, abortions, and the vials she tested independently of their medical society, 3/4 were contaminated. And they injected millions and millions of young women. You're curious to know what the fertility rates in the Philippines are? That's where they're going. That's where they are. There's an organized effort to give tetanus to women. They are stretching the statistics and saying this is an epidemic, of course, serious. UNICEF is sponsoring this particular program. PATH is one of them, and Bill Gates has given, I think in this case, $26 million to a program to eliminate tetanus in the third world. Same kind of things have happened in Uganda. A speech given by Kahura Kuba, which I finally got a hold of him this week by email, so I'm anxious to get more information from him. He went to villages. He was basically kind of a pro-Uganda kind of guy and was talking about national policies, had a radio show. And he noticed it, and he'd go to these small towns, that these people that were getting polio vaccine were getting polio. And he talked to people, and actually in one room with, I think, several hundred people, everybody had lost a child to a death after a vaccine, every family. And in 1 month, he found 600 cases died in Bavara. He found out that they were given oral polio to HIV, which is contraindicated in this country. In fact, he came to this country, called the CDC, and tape recorded and says, what about oral polio? Should you give that anymore? Well, we have a newer, a safer form. It's IPV. It's not a live virus anymore. And they go, oh, no, you can't, we don't use that here. And he goes, what about AIDS patient? Would you give it to AIDS patient? And the guy from the CDC says, no, that would be a death sentence. And so he taped it, went home, and played it on the airways. And then they tried to kill him. He tells that story. He's run off the road. Contamination of polio vaccines was alleged in Nigeria. They found estradiol carcinogens in HIV. I don't have solid, I don't have as much solid evidence of that, but that's been in the press, so I read that as a press release. The local government and health officials talked about it, but they were a little quiet on this type of contaminants. One of the outcomes of this, I guess these debacles, these are the early testing of anti-fertility vaccines in third world countries. UNICEF published a paper, and they said, we have to combat anti-vaccination rumors. We need to learn from our messes, and this is kind of how the New World Order works. So they published a document in trying to figure out how they can do a better job next time. And this is the kind of things we're seeing in the news now. In Mali, they jailed 11 people for refusing child polio vaccination. World Health Organization announces 250 million children to be immunized in a very short period of time. They spread rumors. Now, Nigeria is still refusing, and so they've made a lesson out of Nigeria. Press releases this year saying polio is spreading again. It's out of control, and it's Nigeria's fault because they're not vaccinating. Hunt for holdouts in fight against polio, and this is in Indonesia. So much more coercive policies now. This chills me. This was a press release August '05. On August 30th and 31st, more than 750,000 vaccinators will go house to house and work at vaccination booths across Indonesia to reach more than 24 million children under the age of 5 in one day. In one day. Now, don't you think it's more cost-effective to use about maybe 10,000 vaccinators and take 3 months? Then gain experience. What's the hurry? This was a trial, in my interpretation. This is a trial run in order to vaccinate a lot of people, so if and when something goes wrong in the vaccine, nobody will refuse it. They've already taken it. So it takes a little time for these rumors to spread about abortions, ovulation problems, paralysis, so forth. So they have a trial run now to vaccinate a huge, huge number of people in one day. And I believe it's possible that this infrastructure that's being built in this country with the flu vaccine, this pandemic that's going to come, they're trying to build the infrastructure to do mass vaccinations in a very, very short period of time. It's just a theory. Here's one of the organizations that's doing this with polio, Partners in the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. And this is all still under Gabby's roof, but different sectors of this are being the front runners, if you will. Polio, and Dr. Stan has covered this on his show before. I don't know that much about the controversies, but I am aware that the polio vaccines have been implicated in AIDS. And I've just picked up this tape, Dr. Stan. I can't wait to hear it. I just found this article a couple weeks ago, so I don't know David Gisselquist. He wrote, I guess, a few series of papers here not too long ago that really stunned the world. He looked at the AIDS in Africa and said, you know what, something's wrong. If this is sexual transmission, how come sexually transmitted diseases are on the decline and HIV is on the rise? How come children are HIV positive and their mothers are HIV negative? So the press came out, and I think he must have agreed with this or implied it, that the needles are dirty. The vaccination needles are dirty, without ever considering that it might be what's in the vaccine is what's dirty. Something to think about. Last section here, and this is mind-boggling. Now, the HCG vaccines were, 20 years ago or so. It's been a little while. What's new? You wouldn't believe it. Recombinant DNA techniques. And there's just so much research. And I'm not, this is like dusting off my basic science. I mean, I had a heck of a week. I was in the library and the first-year medical students and pushing them out of the rows to get to some of these books. Targeting vaccinia virus express secretory beta subunit. What they do is they know that if you take naked DNA and inject it into mammalian tissue, you can express. It'll function. DNA is how proteins in your body are created. So you have two options on an anti-fertility front. If you put HCG, the DNA sequence for HCG, into a virus, inject it, what that can do is create an HCG forever. And if it's foreign enough, then you'll get antibodies for it. Now, they've always had trouble getting HCG to be recognized by the body. So the other way they do it is put, instead of the sequence that makes HCG hormone, they make the sequence that makes the HCG antibody. It's passive immunization. So when the body reads the DNA and creates this along with whatever proteins in the cell, it will make the antibodies immediately, indefinitely. So it's basically, through DNA technique, it's a stealth way. I mean, you won't be able to figure this out. It would be a sophisticated lab to discover this. And they've done it, for example, in this study, vaccinia, which is the smallpox. So you can put this in a smallpox vaccine. I don't know how you discover it. It's even done in plants. They've done this in tobacco plants. They've put this DNA sequences into plants, and it expresses anti-HCG antibodies. Last big question, is there any evidence of use here in the U.S. or elsewhere, really, this kind of new technology? Well, I don't have solid evidence, and I really have trouble finding fertility issues. I know that infertility is rising. Fertility, for sure, is dropping, so our families are getting smaller, but infertility rates are definitely rising. But it's kind of a kept secret, and you can see why the government doesn't want to broadcast that we have an epidemic. I asked, all of our residents were married, and we had a 50% incidence of infertility in our residency, 50%. And that, by definition, is it took us more than a year to get pregnant. Some still haven't been able to. That seems high to me. I don't know. Some charts I found, and just very sporadic data, but you can see, and this follows NSSM perfectly, that this is an example of, I think, Denmark and the United States. Their fertility rates started dropping about 10 to 15 years before the developing countries. In this case, I can't read this, too small, Nigeria and another third world country. If you look at the causes of infertility, the textbooks that I pulled just kind of give the usual causes. I mean, male causes, tubal adhesions from pelvic inflammatory disease, ovulatory disorders, but you don't see autoimmunity. If it's going on now from vaccines, we're going to see antibodies. I mean, it's an autoimmune disorder. And here's how I tested this theory. We know there's increasing infertility. Is there autoimmune infertility in miscarriages? What does VAERS have to say? And just thinking how the physiology works, the VAERS database, we're going to see people that have, if it's targeted against testicular tissue or ovarian tissue, from the animal studies I read, it can cause pain, orchitis in the testicular swelling, pelvic inflammatory problems, pelvic pain, and obviously infertility, menstrual disorders, and abortion. And the last thing is, I know from the animal studies they're targeting adolescents. It's a prime time to do this. And the last question is, are we vaccinating adolescents more than ever? I found a number of studies that talked about a new form of infertility in this country and elsewhere. I found more than 400 studies. Autoantibody panels screened in recurrent miscarriages found a very high prevalence of antibodies, not specific antibodies in this study. You can measure lots of different antibodies, but they know that there are certain antibodies that are hallmarks of autoimmune disease, and it's present in this population of folks that miscarriage. Here's some solid numbers. This was an infertility group. I think it was an overseas study, if I'm not mistaken. Control patients, people with normal fertility, had about a 15% incidence of autoantibodies. If you had a history of fertility problems, it got as high as 50%. So we know that infertility people have some issues with autoimmunity. And this is staggering. This looked specifically, and this was from a Prague teaching hospital. The women with menstrual disorders, 39 of them were compared to 15 controls. They looked at anti-ovarian antibodies. And there are chapters in books written on anti-ovarian, anti-fertility vaccines. 100% of them had antibodies against ovarian tissue, only 6% of the controls. So I'm not saying it's direct evidence, but the playing field of infertility, to me, is dramatically different from what I learned in med school. I mean, this is stunning stuff. Here's the vaccine schedule to adolescents, and we're bombarding kids. What's interesting is, what are the potential ones here? All the ones I highlighted are potential viral DNA recombinant targets. These are all viral vaccines. I'm not saying it's being done, but they're candidates. If they're viruses, you can put DNA. They can carry the DNA into the tissue. There's actually, I forgot to tell you this, there was a study that actually looked at putting this DNA into a bacteria. One of the trouble, if you swallowed an antibody, it won't get absorbed. So their trouble, they would love to have, I think, an oral anti-fertility vaccine, but it just doesn't get past the gut. God gave us a great gut. They found if they put it into a bacteria that normally causes gut problems, like an E. coli, they can change the E. coli so it doesn't cause clinical problems, but enough that the E. coli gets incorporated into the bowel wall, and then it secretes into the bloodstream the anti-HCG antibodies. So now there is, through water, through food, and tobacco, so I'm thinking we can inhale this stuff potentially and get antibodies against our fertility targets. Here's the 3 vaccines that have been tested as carriers for HCG. Diphtheria, tetanus, meningococcal, I'll show you about that one. And of course, PPD, there was one study I found that used gonadotropin-releasing hormone, a pituitary target. They put GnRH with the PPD, which is the agent for TB skin test. I went to the conference in Washington, the AAP conference, and I fell out of my chair again. Paul Offit, who holds patents for vaccines, showed the picture, that the structure of the meningococcal vaccine, and it has a diphtheria toxoid carrier in it. It has a carrier. I don't know why it's needed, potentially just to boost the immune response. So all of them, I mean, all the kids that we were giving vaccines to, these groups of vaccines are potential candidates. And here's one coming down the road, another viral one, cervical cancer vaccine. Of course, where do you think the epidemic of cervical cancer is? Indonesia, Asia, South Africa. I mean, so that's where all, I mean, if you added up the mortality rates they're saying from all these diseases, Africa would be minus in population. There would be, it would be a black hole or something. There would be nobody there. Interesting thought, is it cost effective to fight a war in population with vaccines? Here's a perspective. Iraq war, $3.9 billion per month. Iraq and Afghanistan war, $300 billion per month, or $300 billion since the war. Gavi was initially funded with $2 billion. So it's a cheap deal. And people don't run from these bullets. They run towards these bullets. So it's ideal. And I think with that, I will say that, you know, it's sobering. It's been an interesting trip these last 3 years to see this. And I know that sometimes you can get down when you see some very sobering things. But if anything, I can tell you my faith has been, you know, stronger now than it's ever been. And I've been able to use some of these tragedies that we hear about to show people the truth. And I've taken those opportunities, and I've learned to really, really trust God in the road He's put before me. And I trust Him every day. And I hope you do too.